Disclaimer: this content is for mature audiences only. Viewer discretion is advised. I never thought one night could change the way I saw my husband. We had been married for 6 years, and while our relationship had its ups and downs, we always found our way back to each other. But that night was different. It was the kind of night that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the person sleeping beside you. It started off like any other evening. We had just finished dinner, a quiet meal at home, filled with the usual small talk about work and weekend plans. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until he received a message on his phone. I noticed how his expression shifted just for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He quickly put the phone away, forcing a smile when he saw me watching. I didn't think much of it at first, but something in my gut told me something was off. As the night went on, his behavior became more unusual. He was restless, pacing around the living room, checking his phone more often than usual. And then, without explanation, he grabbed his car keys and said he needed to step out. Just for a little while, he assured me, his voice oddly tense. Normally, I wouldn't question it. He had the freedom to go wherever he wanted. But this time, something about the way he avoided eye contact made me uneasy. A part of me wanted to let it go, to trust that there was nothing to worry about. But another part of me, the part that had spent years learning his every habit, his every mood, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. So I did something I never thought I would do. I decided to follow him. What I saw next left me speechless. My hands trembled, my heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts. It was a moment that changed everything. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment in your relationship that made you question everything? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. And if you want to know what happened that night, make sure to stay tuned for the next part of the story. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. The cool night air hit my face as I quietly followed my husband's car down the dimly lit streets. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my heart racing faster with each turn he took. I kept a safe distance, afraid he might notice me, but close enough that I wouldn't lose him. My mind was spinning with possibilities. Where could he be going at this hour? Was he meeting someone? Was he in some kind of trouble? I wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe he just needed space. Maybe it was work-related, or maybe I was overthinking. But deep down, something told me that this was different. It wasn't just the way he left. It was the way he looked at me before walking out the door. Like he was hiding something. After about 20 minutes of driving, his car slowed down and pulled into a small parking lot beside an unfamiliar building. I quickly turned off my headlights and parked at a distance, watching as he got out of the car. My pulse pounded in my ears as I squinted through the windshield. He stood there for a moment, glancing around, as if making sure no one was watching. Then he walked inside. I hesitated. A part of me wanted to get out and follow him, to see with my own eyes what was going on. But another part of me was scared of what I might find. What if it was something I wasn't ready to know? Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. My mind jumped to conclusions, each one worse than the last. Was he seeing someone? Was he in trouble? Or was this something even more unexpected? My stomach tightened as I thought about all the little signs I had ignored over the past few weeks. His distracted behavior, the late-night messages, the way he seemed distant even when we were together. Had I missed something obvious? Just as I was about to get out of the car, I saw movement near the entrance. My breath caught in my throat as the door opened, and I saw him step out. But he wasn't alone. I leaned forward, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My chest tightened, and 1,000 questions flooded my mind. Who was this person? And why did my husband look so different, so tense, so unlike himself? I wasn't sure if I was ready for the truth, but there was no turning back now. My breath hitched as I sank lower in my seat, my eyes locked on my husband and the stranger beside him. The dim glow of the streetlight wasn't enough for me to make out their face clearly, but I could tell it wasn't someone I recognized. They stood close, speaking in hushed voices, their body language tense. My husband kept glancing over his shoulder, as if he was nervous about being seen. Why? Who was this person? And why did he look so different? So unlike the man I had spent years building a life with. I leaned forward slightly, my fingers gripping the steering wheel. The stranger handed him something, something small, barely visible in the dark. My husband hesitated before taking it, looking around once more before stuffing it into his pocket. My stomach twisted. This wasn't a casual meeting. This wasn't just some late-night errand or a coincidence. This was something else. A million thoughts flooded my mind, each one worse than the last. Was he in some kind of trouble? Was this person blackmailing him? Or had he been keeping secrets from me for longer than I realized? I watched as they exchanged a few more words, the tension thick between them. Then, without warning, the stranger reached out, gripping my husband's arm. It wasn't an affectionate touch. It was firm, almost urgent. My husband stiffened, his jaw tightening as he pulled away. And then, just as quickly as it started, the moment was over. The stranger turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. My husband lingered for a second, staring at the ground, his hands in his pockets. He looked conflicted, like he was carrying something heavy, something he couldn't share. I should have driven away. I should have gone home and waited for him to return, pretending I hadn't seen any of this. But I couldn't. My fingers hovered over my phone. Should I call him right now? Confront him? Or should I wait and see if he told me the truth on his own? What would you do? If you were in my place, would you have followed him? Would you confront him right away or wait for the right moment? Let me know in the comments. And stay tuned, because what happened next was something I never saw coming. I couldn't bring myself to start the car. My heart was racing, my thoughts tangled in confusion and fear. I had followed my husband here, seen him meet a stranger, watched their tense exchange. Yet I still had no idea what was really happening. My instincts screamed that this was more than a harmless encounter. There was something in the way he moved, the way he hesitated, the way he kept looking over his shoulder. He wasn't just being secretive. He was scared. I watched as he lingered outside the building, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He exhaled sharply, then glanced around one last time before heading back to his car. My breath caught as he turned in my direction, and for a moment I thought he had spotted me. I ducked lower, my fingers trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, but he didn't stop. He climbed into his car, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot. I had two choices: go home and pretend I never saw any of this, or keep following him. But at this point, was I even prepared for the truth? Without thinking, I started my car and eased onto the road behind him. He drove slower than before, like his mind was somewhere else. My hands were clammy against the wheel as I stayed a few cars behind, keeping my distance. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening. The drive felt endless, but when he finally turned onto our street, a new kind of dread settled in my chest. I watched as he pulled into our driveway, sitting in the car for a long moment before finally getting out. He moved like a man carrying a secret too heavy for him, his shoulders tense, his steps slow. I parked a few houses away, still hidden in the shadows, waiting for him to go inside. But just as I reached for my phone, something happened that made my stomach drop. He didn't go inside. Instead, he pulled out his phone, staring at the screen as if deciding what to do next. Then, to my shock, he turned and walked down the street, away from our home. Where was he going now? And why did it feel like I was chasing a version of him I had never met before? What do you think is really happening here? Drop your thoughts in the comments and don't miss what happens next, because the truth is about to change everything. My pulse pounded in my ears as I watched my husband walk away from our house, his silhouette disappearing into the quiet, darkened street. I had followed him all the way here, expecting him to go inside, to act like nothing had happened. But instead, he was leaving again. And this time, I had no idea where he was going. Something was wrong. I hesitated, gripping my phone in my hands. Should I call him? Ask him where he was? But what if he lied? What if he told me something completely different from what I had just seen? I wasn't sure I was ready to hear his voice, to listen to him pretend everything was normal when I knew for a fact that it wasn't. So I made a choice. I slipped out of my car and started following him on foot. My breath was unsteady, my steps light as I moved through the shadows. He wasn't walking fast, just enough to seem like he had a purpose. I stayed far enough behind that he wouldn't notice me, my heart hammering in my chest. And then he stopped. I pressed myself against the side of a building, barely daring to breathe. He pulled out his phone again, staring at the screen for a long moment before dialing a number. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but his body language told me everything. He was tense, nervous. His hand ran through his hair, his posture stiff. Then, out of nowhere, he turned sharply and disappeared into an alleyway. Panic surged through me. An alley? What was he doing? Who was he meeting now? My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, but my feet moved on instinct, pulling me forward. I reached the edge of the alley and carefully peeked around the corner. And what I saw sent a chill down my spine. He wasn't alone, but it wasn't the same person from before. This was someone else. Someone whose presence made my husband visibly uneasy. I could see it in the way he stood, the way he kept shifting from one foot to the other, like he wanted to leave but couldn't. The stranger took a step closer, speaking too quietly for me to hear. My husband responded, his voice low, strained. And then the stranger reached into his pocket and pulled something out. I couldn't see what it was, but I saw the way my husband's shoulders tensed, the way his hands clenched at his sides, and that's when I knew. This wasn't just some coincidence. Something bigger was happening, something that my husband had been keeping from me. And in that moment, standing there in the dark, I realized I might not be ready for the truth. What do you think is really going on? If you were in my shoes, would you confront him right now or wait to find out more? Drop your thoughts in the comments and stay tuned, because this story is far from over. A lump formed in my throat as I pressed my back against the cold brick wall, trying to stay hidden. My husband stood a few feet away, facing the stranger in the alley. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. He was in deep, and whatever this was, it wasn't good. Then I saw it. The stranger pulled something out of his pocket, something small, something my husband hesitated before taking. My heart pounded as I leaned in, straining to see. Was it money? A key? A note? But just as I thought I had figured it out, my husband did something that stopped me cold. He laughed, not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable chuckle, but a real, genuine laugh. And then, as if nothing had ever been tense between them, they shook hands. My head spun. None of this made sense. One minute he looked terrified, like he was being blackmailed or threatened. Now he was laughing, shaking hands like they were old friends. I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped out of the shadows, my voice shaking. What's going on? My husband froze. His eyes widened in shock as he turned toward me. The stranger looked between us, his expression unreadable. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then my husband let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair. "You followed me?" he asked. I crossed my arms. What was I supposed to do? You've been acting weird for weeks, sneaking out in the middle of the night, meeting people in alleys. How could I not follow you? The stranger smirked, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Guess you have some explaining to do," he said to my husband before nodding at me and walking away. I turned back to my husband, waiting for answers. He sighed again, looking almost guilty. "I wasn't hiding something from you," he admitted. "I was planning something. For you." I blinked. "What?" He hesitated, then reached into his pocket, pulling out the item he had just received. A small box. My breath caught. "I was working on a surprise," he said. "A new ring. For our anniversary." My chest tightened as I stared at him, my mind struggling to process everything. After all the tension, the late-night meetings, the secrecy, this was what he had been hiding? But just as relief started washing over me, something still felt off. I glanced down the alley where the stranger had disappeared, then back at my husband. "If that's true," I said slowly, "then why did you look so scared?" His smile faltered for just a second, a brief flicker of something I couldn't quite read. And in that moment, I realized the real secret was something he still wasn't telling me. My husband's smile faltered for just a second, but it was enough. That flicker of hesitation, the momentary shift in his expression, it told me that there was still something he wasn't saying. My heart, which had started to settle after his explanation, picked up speed again. "Why did you look so scared?" I asked, my voice softer now, less accusing, but still searching for the truth. He exhaled, running a hand down his face. "Because I thought you wouldn't understand," he admitted. "I knew how it looked, me sneaking around, meeting people in secret. But it wasn't just about the ring." I stayed silent, waiting. He glanced down the alley as if making sure no one was still there, then turned back to me. "I was trying to fix something," he said. "Something from my past." His past. My mind raced. He never talked much about it, but I knew there were things he had kept buried before we met. I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" He hesitated before finally answering. "The man you saw me with, he's someone I owed. Not money, something else. A favor, a mistake I made a long time ago." He shook his head. "I thought I could handle it quietly, that I could settle things without you ever knowing. But when I saw you here, I realized I should have told you from the beginning." Relief and frustration warred inside me. I wasn't sure whether to be angry or just exhausted. "So it's over?" I asked. He nodded. "It is. I promise." I studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of a lie. But this time, there was nothing but honesty. I let out a shaky breath, finally allowing my shoulders to relax. "Next time, don't keep secrets," I said. "No matter what." A small smile touched his lips. "I won't." We stood there for a moment, the tension between us finally breaking. Then he reached for my hand, lacing his fingers with mine. "Let's go home?" he asked. I nodded, and as we walked away together, I realized something. Trust isn't about always knowing the answers. It's about believing that, even in the hardest moments, you'll find your way back to each other. But a tiny voice in the back of my mind whispered one last question. Was it really over? Let me know what you think in the comments. Would you have trusted him? Or does something still feel off? And if you want a sequel, hit that like button, because this story might not be over just yet.